This ain't just a channel, this is BBTV.
This isn't about last night or what happened after dark. This is about the middle of the day moments where something small turns nuclear before you even finish your coffee.
One sentence, one reaction, one emotional spark, and suddenly the whole situation is on fire. Welcome to Freak Out Friday on Ask a Bee, because this one didn't just escalate, it got out of hand real fast.
Boss be rising, BBTV's igniting, turn the volume up. Yeah, the whole world's invited, from the gravel roads to the neon dreams. She built an empire out of broken wings. Boss be rising, sky ain't even the ceiling when she hits go live. Everybody feels it.
Well, here we go. I'm late. I've got the wrong intro, but that's okay. We're here, right? Welcome back to Jukebox Journey, the relationship-driven music history show where we slow down on real people making real decisions inside working groups, where we track who crossed paths, who vouched for who, and, who replaced who. How collaborators learn to function under pressure, and what consequences followed years later. And tonight's episode centers on how the core creative partnership inside Linkin Park came together, how that partnership operated once the project expanded into a large touring and recording operation, and what shifted when the structure that had carried the group for so long could no longer continue in the same way. Because instead of ranking albums or walking through release schedules, we're going to focus on the collaboration between Mike Shinoda and Chester Bennington. Two musicians, I can't even talk, two musicians who did not grow up together, were not part of the same local scene, and entered the same project at very different moments in their lives. And already embedded in a developing group that had spent, years experimenting with personal rehearsal spaces. Now, unfinished sounds while the other was moving between auditions and dissolved bands, searching for a stable long-term situation. And that imbalance at the starting line matters because, it shaped how early rehearsals worked, how authority was negotiated inside writing rooms, and how creative trust formed when songs were still skeletal ideas, instead of tour-tested anthems. Now, how responsibilities were divided once, managers, labels, contracts, and crews began orbiting the band, how interviews were assigned, how public visibility landed unevenly on certain members, and definitely how disagreements were handled quietly instead of through public feuds. And across the hour, we're going to linger on moments that usually get rushed in music storytelling, the audition process, and who advocated for a final decision. The first writing sessions were two very different instincts and had to find a workable rhythm. The touring years, when exhaustion forced roles to harden or soften, the periods when experimentation created internal recalibration instead of consensus, and the later conversations that arise when a long-running partnership confronts loss and uncertainty. Because Saturday Night Jukebox Journey is about pulling back the curtain, without anyone into heroes or villains, but about understanding how collaboration actually functions when people are locked into buses and studios, press cycles, and deadline-driven recording, schedules for decades, and about examining how leadership becomes shared rather than formally assigned. One person can become the public face while another quietly architects behind the scenes, how loyalty is maintained through routine rather than speeches, and compromise becomes optional operational, instead of dramatic, and how small structural decisions made early on can echo years later. in ways nobody predicted at the time, right? I love bees. I'm so glad you love bees. ADHD, I got that too. ADHD mom in UK. Well, I'm very happy to have you and thank you. So, if you're watching live tonight, this is the kind of episode where we pause, rewind, read from documented interviews when useful, let chat weigh in on moments of transition, and give the early choices enough space to breathe instead of compressing decades of working relationships into a few fast bullet points. Because, the goal here is not to mythologize, but to map and map introductions and auditions, negotiations, touring logistics, creative authority, management layers, and the private problem solving that keeps a group functioning long after the novelty wears off. And by the end of the night, hopefully, you should have a much clearer picture of how two people who started as strangers learned to build inside the same structure, how the structure stabilized under success, and hey, how it absorbed pressure when expectations rose. Eventually, face circumstances, that forced everyone involved to rethink that what continuing even meant. And that's got to be a hard one. It's got to be. Which is exactly where we are headed next as we rewind the period before these two musicians ever shared a rehearsal room and look closely at what each side of that future collaboration was already carrying into the situation when their paths finally crossed. All right. So give me 1 second here. Let me load up. And I even have us a little video to go with it. So tonight's episode, okay, is built around the long argument over Chester Bennington and how people inside and outside the music industry related to him at different moments in his career. So to begin that story, we have to slow down before any reappraisal, right? Before critics soften, before institutions revised reviews, and look carefully at how Chester functioned inside Linkin Park as a working collaborator. Now, yes, I'm gonna stop for just 1 second to put this out there. Yes, we know what happened to Chester. Okay, he took his own life, and that's not what I'm trying to center this around. Okay, because to me, I hate that he's done this to himself. Okay, I hate that he's gone by his own hand. But let me tell you something. He was still human, and we are all human, and we all have issues. And let me tell you, I've had my own. Okay, but here's the thing. He's human. He was human. He was still human. Okay, you got to remember that part. I think that's the biggest part people forget, especially about somebody who's in the limelight, because they don't know, all the details. They just want to pick and choose and decide for themselves. And that's not what I do here. Okay, I'm not here to try and bum their whole room out because yes, he's gone, and I hate that. Believe me, I cried. But here's the deal. The man was a genius, and we're going to celebrate that. So, because with that internal role, what later shaped how outsiders judged him, since when he entered the group, he was not stepping into a finished machine, but into a project that had already been rehearsing and demoing, cycling through ideas while still searching for the right front space, right? Front voice. And that meant the earliest relationships he formed were professional built around auditions, trial sessions, and, whether his vocal approach fit what the rest of the band was attempting to construct, which immediately created a practical dynamic where he was, evaluated not only on personality, but on adaptability and reliability, and how quickly he could integrate into a structure that already had routines and creative hierarchies forming. And once he was accepted, the relationship, it shifted into something operational rather than symbolic. With long writing days, repeated takes in studios, tour rehearsals, and constant recalibration over who handled which sections of the song, how vocal lines interacted with rap verses and, electronics, how performances were staged, how front of house energy matched the arrangements being built behind the scenes. Those negotiations mattered because they placed Chester in a position where he became the most visible figure to audiences while still operating inside that collective that depended on shared decision making, which, it created a split between public perception and internal reality. Since fans and press increasingly associated the band's emotional intensity with his delivery, while the group itself continued functioning through collaborative processes, production meetings, and long term touring logistics that required compromise rather than single control. And that division is essential to understanding why later debates about the band often focus so heavily on him as an individual rather than on the systems surrounding him. Because from the outside, he appeared to embody the group's vulnerability, while inside the machine, he was one part of a rotating workload that included songwriting and lots of sessions of songwriting, media obligations, travel schedules, and the physical strain of performing night after night. And over time, that workload, it created additional layers in his relationships with bandmates, managers, and labels, since success added new expectations that had to be negotiated collectively, including how interviews were divided, who spoke for the group in certain contexts, how touring breaks were scheduled, and how creative disagreements were contained so they did not spill into public narratives. Those arrangements shaped how Chester was positioned publicly as well as how he functioned privately. Because while audiences increasingly projected meaning onto his voice, the internal conversations remained about deadlines, revisions, rehearsals, and maintaining cohesion across years of constant movement, which meant that, his role was refined less by, I guess, symbolic status inside this band and more by endurance and consistency, showing up for sessions, delivering takes under pressure, and sustaining performances across long cycles of recording and touring. And that distinction is important because it explains why later outside reappraisals sometimes flatten, the complexity of his position just by focusing solely on what listeners heard rather than on how he operated day to day inside a large collaborative enterprise, since the relationships that mattered most in shaping his career were not abstract audiences, but the people he worked with in studios, on buses, and in meetings about the next release or tour routing. And in that environment, his reputation among collaborators was built on whether he could adapt to evolving material, whether he could maintain professionalism under fatigue, and definitely where he could participate in creative negotiation when direction shifted, all of which led into the stability of the group over long stretches of time. And the mid-career phase of the band, those internal systems had become highly routinized and established, and processing for writing, recording, promotion, and live production that require everyone to occupy defined lanes, which further reinforced the whole contrast between how Chester was read publicly and how he was experienced internally. Because externally, he was increasingly framed as the emotional focal point, while internally, he was still one contributor among several who had to manage practical constraints and collective decisions. And that gap between inside and outside perspectives is the foundation for the later critical arguments we are going to examine tonight. Since many of the judgments that circulated in press and online spaces were made without access to those internal working relationships, focusing instead on image and genre labels or surface level impressions of performance. While the people around him were navigating schedules, contracts, long term collaborations, that is why the first thing we need to establish before moving into how critics, pardon me, educators and older listeners reassessed the band in the simple structural reality. Chester entered the group through an audition process. He earned his place through repeated collaborative labor, became the most visible figure to audiences while remaining embedded in a collective decision making system. And then he spent years operating inside professional routines that demanded reliability as much as expression. Because without understanding that internal position, how he was hired, how he worked, how he negotiated space with bandmates, and how his success reshaped daily operations, it becomes impossible to evaluate why later generations and institutions and commentators argued so intensely over what he represented, which is exactly what we are going to turn to next as we move outward from the band's internal dynamics and begin examining how people outside the group talked about him at different stages of the band's career. And what events triggered those conversations to change. So, loading up again, forgive me. Now, in this next part of the story, pardon me, I'm getting distracted. In this next part of the story, we move outside the rehearsal rooms and, at tour buses and into the way Chester Bennington and Linkin Park were talked about by critics, educators, older musicians, and online communities while the group was active. Because alongside the internal systems we just established here, there was a parallel conversation happening in press outlets and, at academic music circles and early internet forums that framed the band through genre labels and cultural shorthand rather than through its internal working relationships. And in the early 2000s, that framing often came from people who did not feel personally connected to the audience the band attracted, okay, which meant reviews and commentary frequently positioned the group as a product of youth culture, trend cycles, or commercial calculation rather than a long-term collaborative unit. And built through auditions, rehearsal disciplines, and negotiated creative roles. And in those spaces, Chester's vocal style became one of the most visible flashpoints since his delivery was often described in shorthand terms that emphasized intensity or emotional openness without engaging with how that style functioned inside the band's writing process or how it had been selected in the first place through audition and repeated studio work. That gap between how insiders understood his job and how outsiders summarized it, created a simplified public narrative that circulated for years, reinforced by the way early internet culture rewarded quick labels and memes and comparisons to other acts rather than slow institutional analysis, which meant that in many discussions, he was not treated as a hired collaborator, okay, who had integrated into a pre existing project and helped stabilize, but instead as a symbol for a particular moment in popular music. And those symbols mattered because they shaped how college aged listeners, older musicians, and music teachers talked about the band in classrooms, rehearsal spaces, and informal debates about what counted as technical skill or artistic seriousness, with some educators and critics later describing how they initially dismissed the group in part because of the audiences they attract and the scenes they were associated with rather than because of those listening or direct engagement with the band's working methods. And, over time, that created, I guess, a feedback loop in which public commentary influenced reputation. Reputation influenced which institutions took the music seriously, and that institutional distance in turn reinforced the idea that the band sat outside certain traditional critical hierarchies, right? Even while inside their own operation, Chester and his bandmates were locked into demanding professional routines of touring, recording, and revision cycles that required consistency and negotiation rather than spectacle. And what became or becomes important for this episode is not whether those early judgments were correct or incorrect in an abstract sense, but how they structured relationships between the band and the people positioned as cultural gatekeepers, because those relationships determine who gets invited into academic discussions. So, whose work is cited in textbooks and albums are revisited years later by critics, whose reputations, and in many cases, the people who later wrote about reevaluating the group, describe starting from a place of distance or even mild hostility towards what the band represented culturally, and only returning years later, often after shifts in the broader musical landscape or after major events in the band's history to reconsider earlier positions, which is where Chester becomes central again, because his performances, lyrics, and public image were frequently treated as shorthand for the entire group in those debates, meaning that when commentators reassessed their opinions, they often framed that shift through him rather than through the quieter internal mechanisms of collaboration we talked about earlier, right? And that tendency to personalize institutional reconsideration around a single figure, it reveals how strongly he had become associated with the band's identity in the public imagination, even though inside the organization his role had always been embedded in collective decision making. And this is where generational change enters the story, okay? Because younger listeners who encountered the band later through streaming platforms, social media clips, or retrospective discussions, often approached the music without the same cultural baggage that shaped early 2000s criticisms, which also created a new wave of conversation in which older critics and educators found themselves responding not only to the band, but to the students and the fans and online communities who framed Chester's work differently than they had 2 decades earlier. And those interactions between generations, teachers, and students, veteran musicians, younger performers, critics, and online audiences, it became another layer of relationship that affected how the band's legacy was negotiated in public, since reputations are not fixed objects, but ongoing negotiations between creators and the people who interpret their work. And in this case, those negotiations stretched across years, technological shifts, and cultural turnover, producing a situation where the same performances that once attracted skepticism were later being cited as evidence of craft, intention, or emotionally specificity. Specificity, there you go. Not because the recordings themselves had changed, but because the people doing the listening had changed. And that is the tension we are going to keep returning to tonight. The difference between how Chester functioned inside a tightly organized collaborative system through and how it works as filtered through outside communities that had their own hierarchies, assumptions, and generational reference points. Because understanding that tension is what allows us to make sense of the later re-evaluation essays. Reddit debates and institutional rewrites that began appearing years after the band had already built its career. And in the next part of the show, okay, we're going to narrow it in on those later conversations themselves. How specific critics, educators, and longtime skeptics publicly described changing their minds, what events prompted those rehearsals, and how those statements circulated online and reshaped the way new audiences approached Chester's work long after the original moment had passed. But before we do that, I'm going to take my much needed little break. I got a little something new for you this week. I decided to play around some more AI. So, I'm an Aussie fan, and it's probably bad that I did this, but I think he would have fun with it. So, y'all, I'll be right back. Thanks. Go. How come we're not going? Oh, Lord, help me. My turn.
Eyes of fire, hands of stone. I'm alive, but I'm alone. Bats and shadows, wings of fright, dancing demons in the night. Bats and shadows, take my soul, lose control, lose control.
She came from the quiet storms, built a fire from the ground, turned a whisper to a warning. Now her voice shakes the town. Every setback was a lesson, every doubt became a key, unlocking something bigger. That's the rise of Boss B. When the lights go low, her vision hits high. She built a whole damn network off a promise and a try. Every sunrise, every moment, she's stacking legacy. This ain't just a channel, this is BBTV. Boss B rising, BBTV's igniting. Turn the volume up, yeah, the whole world's invited. From the gravel roads to the neon dreams, she built an empire out of broken wings. Boss B rising, sky ain't even the ceiling. When she hits go live, everybody feels it. She's the queen of the comeback, the storm in the stream, crafting stories out of heartbeats, making visions out of dreams. Got thunder in the hustle, got a voice that cuts clean. Every mic she touches turns the power unseen. So let further spin the numbers, let the views rise slow or fast. Boss B doesn't measure wins by echoes of the past. This moment is a pivot, this season's history. Bow down to the founder of the BBTV dynasty. Boss B rising, BBTV's igniting. Turn the volume up, yeah, the whole world's invited. From the gravel roads to the neon dreams, she built an empire out of broken wings. Boss B rising, sky ain't even the ceiling. When she hits go live, everybody feels it. She's got fire in the head, it's got truth in the frame, got a heart that won't retire and a gift you can't name. Every loop, every letter, every dream she sets free, it's a love note to the world sign. Boss B. And the world keeps watching as the numbers climb, but she's counting all the moments, not the dollar signs. From the late night grind to the daylight scene, she's building something bigger than the algorithm's dream. Boss B rising, BBTV shining, her story's rewriting, a legacy in real time. Boss B rising, BBTV's igniting. Turn the volume up, yeah, the whole world's invited. From the gravel roads to the neon dreams, she built an empire out of broken wings. Boss B rising, sky ain't even the ceiling. When she hits go live, everybody feels it. watch her take her place. This is BBTV. This is her grace.
Join Boss B for Ask a Bee Monday through Friday, 12 noon Central Standard Time and Jukebox Journey every Saturday, 8 p.m. Central Standard Time.
All right, welcome back. Let's get into the last part of this show now. So in this part of the night, we're going to, I guess, move away from institutions and critics and into the stories that everyday listeners have been telling about Chester Bennington and Linkin Park. Because alongside formal reappraisals, there has been a parallel archive forming for years on forums, comment sections, and long form Reddit posts where people document when and why their relationship to the band changed. And what makes those posts valuable for this show is not whether they praise or criticize the music, but how they trace personal shifts in perception over time, often written by people who describe themselves as former skeptics. So casual listeners too, who avoided the group in the early 2000s because of peer pressure, or older fans who initially dismissed the band based on genre labels and imagery, or the reputations that circulated online rather than from close engagement. And in many of those accounts, the writers reconstruct a timeline of avoidance followed by a return explaining that they encountered the band again years later through a roommate's playlist, a child's discovering the music. My kids, they discovered Chester Bennington and went crazy. And this was after the fact, a viral clip, or, like a Guitar Hero, stuff like that, right? Or like a retrospective article, and decided to listen without the cultural assumptions they had carried before. And that decision to re-listen becomes the hinge of this story, because it reframes Chester not as a a caricature drawn from early memes or dismissive commentary, but as a working vocalist inside a collaborative group whose performances they now hear differently. And those writers, they frequently describe being surprised not by fame or scale, but by details they claim they overlooked the first time around, such as, how delivery shifts within a song, how his parts interact with other voices, or how certain lyrics land differently when encountered later in life. And just as important for Jukebox Journey purposes is the way those posts situate the writers in relation to other people, since many of them include friends who mocked the band in high school, or music store coworkers who argued over whether they were credible, college classmates who debated them in dorm rooms, or spouses who introduced the music years later, which turns these reevaluations into social stories rather than solitary listening experiences, showing how opinion about Chester And the band circulated through friend groups and workplaces long before critics revisited their stances publicly. And another reoccurring pattern in these threads is discomfort around timing, because some writers explicitly say they resisted revisiting the group immediately after Chester's death, worrying that, any change in opinion might be driven by sympathy later rather than be reassessment, right? While others admit that the news itself prompted them to look back at interviews, performances, and lyrics they had previously ignored, and those two reactions, avoidance versus return, often appear side by side in comment chains, right? Creating long debates about whether tragedy should trigger renewed listening at all. And those debates matter because they expose how listeners negotiate their own motives in public, effectively auditing themselves in front of strangers by explaining why they think their new opinions are or are not legitimate. And in that sense, these Reddit stories become records of reputational renegotiation happening in real time, with posters responding to each other's memories, challenging timelines, adding details about when certain songs first entered their lives, or arguing over whether early mockery came from marketing or fashion or age demographics or even online culture rather than from the music itself. And taken together, those threads show Chester operating not only as a singer inside a band, but as a symbolic reference point in people's personal histories. Someone whose voice became attached to particular stages of listeners' lives and then returned later as an object of reconsideration. And for this episode, the key detail is that these are not anonymous crowd reactions, but narrative reconstructions where people carefully lay out how their thinking changed, whose influence had changed, what conversations triggered second looks, and what hesitations remained afterwards, because that process mirrors what we saw with critics and educators in earlier segments. But at a grassroots level, where there are no review editors or academic committees, only individuals negotiating reputation with peers in comment threads and long posts. And that is why these Reddit stories matter to the larger Jukebox Journey arc tonight, since they demonstrate that the reevaluation of Chester did not come solely from institutions revising their records, but from thousands of small interpersonal chain exchanges. Friends sending links, students arguing with teachers, family members introducing playlists, and strangers debating in forums. That collectively reshaped how his work was framed for new audiences. And in the next and final major segment before we close the show, we're going to step back from those individual narratives and look at the longer term consequences of this shift and the shifting conversation, focusing on what it means for surviving band members, for legacy management, and for how Chester continues to be positioned in public disclosure or discourse years after the original moment when those early judgments were, first made. Pardon me. One moment. All right. So in this next phase of the story, if I can get my stuff together here, the conversation around silly thing, Chester has shifted in a more visible and public way, right? Because after years in which early judgments about Linkin Park had circulated relatively unchanged through reviews, classroom conversations, and online shorthand, A growing number of critics and teachers and longtime skeptics began publishing explicit reassessments of their earlier positions, sometimes framing those reversals as uncomfortable admissions that they had underestimated the group, sometimes stressing that they resisted the idea of giving additional credit simply, because a prominent member had died. Sometimes describing how they returned to the music only after noticing that, younger listeners were approaching it with seriousness rather than irony, which created a second order relationship dynamic in which commentators were no longer responding only to the band itself, but to audiences who were defending, reinterpreting, or rediscovering it in public forums, right? That change in tone mattered because it moved the debate from private opinion to institutional record, with review outlets revising scores, academic instructors referencing the group differently in coursework, and online essays circulating widely that framed earlier dismissals as products of cultural bias or even generational distance rather than of close listening. And in many of those pieces, Chester became the central reference point for explaining why opinions had changed, since writers focused on how his vocal technique, lyrical delivery, and stage presence had been caricatured in earlier commentary and then reconsidered when those same elements were examined before carefully years later, especially by the people who had originally approached the band from outside its core audience, which in turn created a new feedback loop where revised critiques were debated by fans, reposted across social platforms, challenged by others who argued that reassessment after tragedy risked emotional inflation, and it dissected by educators trying to separate technical analysis from sympathy. So that friction is crucial to Jukebox Journey this story because it shows how reputation is negotiated through argument rather than consensus, with Chester positioned not only as a performer but as a symbolic figure around whom these debates clustered. Even though many of the reassessing writers emphasized that their change of heart came from re-engaging with full albums, live footage, and interviews rather than from any single viral clip, which highlights another layer of relationship in this episode. The relationship between past critics and their own prior writing, since several of these reversals involved people publicly contradicting or qualifying their earlier reviews, effectively renegotiating their professional identity in front of readers and students. And the act of self-correction is rare enough in cultural criticism that it drew attention on its own, prompting threads, reaction posts, and classroom discussions about whether gatekeepers have a responsibility to revisit old judgments when cultural context changes. And those meta debates fed directly into how Chester's work was reframed for new audiences encountering the band for the first time through retrospective articles rather than, through contemporaneous releases. Meaning that for many, mostly the younger listeners, his reputation was being mediated not only by the recordings themselves, but by these second wave conversations about how critics once talked about him and why they were now speaking differently, which layered interpretation on top of interpretation and made the story less about any single moment in the band's active years and more about how long-term public narratives evolve and then fracture and recombine as different generations take control of platforms and institutions. And this is where the Reddit threads, the TikTok discussions, and long form essays become especially relevant for tonight's show because they capture ordinary listeners, musicians, and teachers arguing in real time about whether early mockery was fair, whether later praise is inflated, and whether Chester's visibility had overshadowed the collective nature of the band's work, just turning the reappraisal into an ongoing negotiation rather than a settled verdict. And in the final stretch of this segment, okay, what matters is not choosing a side, but documenting how those arguments circulate, who is making them, what experiences they cite, and how those claims reshape public understandings years after the fact. Because that process of debate, critics revisiting themselves, sorry, my dog, educators adjusting syllabi, and younger listeners reframing older narratives, is the mechanism through which Chester's reputation continues to be rebuilt in public. And in this last little bit of the show, we're going to, we've gotten a little bit closer to the grassroots level by looking directly at the kinds of Reddit stories and personal accounts that fans and former skeptics have posted about when and why they changed their minds. You can go over to Reddit and you can see all kinds of stuff over Chester. Every bit of it is, you'd think that you would, oh, well, he was a coward or something like that. That's not what you see there. That's the crazy thing about it. I fully expected to go over there just for reference points and everything, of course. I fully expected to go over there and find nothing but hate, but that's not what I found. And let me say this too, because I think this is so important. If you ever feel the need, if you ever need help, if you ever need even just to talk to somebody, you will see my email throughout this. Don't do something this desperate. The world lost a very amazing musician because he was pushed too hard. As far as I'm concerned, that's the reason. He was pushed too hard. So don't get that way. Don't be there. Okay. There are numbers you can call anonymously. There are people you can talk to. And I am one of those people. I will happily sit down and have an email or conversation with you. I can't give you my phone number, obvious reasons. But even if you just want to come here and say, hey, can we talk? We'll talk. Okay. Don't ever, ever go this desperate. All right. So as we close out tonight's Jukebox Journey, please listen to what I said. If you ever need somebody, and you will see it at the end of this, I have a few promos to show you. My email me anytime we can talk. Okay. So, as we close out tonight's Jukebox Journey, what we have traced is not a verdict, but a chain of relationships that keeps evolving, beginning with how Chester Bennington functioned inside Linkin Park as a hired collaborator working within a collective system, moving outward to the way critics, educators, and older musicians framed that work while the band was active. Then forward again to later reassessments, online debates, and personal stories where listeners publicly documented when and why their own views shifted. Because taken together, those layers show how reputations are not fixed at the moment music is released, but are constantly renegotiated through conversations between artists, audiences, institutions, and generations that were never in the same room at the same time. And what matters for this show is not deciding who was right in any single phase of that argument, but understanding how those phases, they connect. how early genres, labels hardened into shorthand, how later listening reopened questions, tragedy complicated interpretation, and definitely how everyday people, teachers, journalists, and fans all became participants in reshaping the public story, sometimes by revising old writing, and sometimes by posting long reflections in forums, introducing music to younger listeners who had no memory of the original backlash at all. Because those acts, re listening, reconsidering, disputing, and documenting, are the mechanisms through which legacies change long after touring cycles and press runs have ended. And they also remind us that collaborative work does not belong solely to the moment it was created, but keeps being reframed as new communities encounter it under different cultural conditions. So, as you leave tonight's episode, the question we are deliberately not answering for you is whether the early criticism was fair or the later praise is more accurate, but rather how those judgments were formed, who made them, who challenged them, and what events caused people to speak differently than they once did. Since that process itself is the story we came to tell. And with that, we'll wrap this one up. Thank you, everybody who joined the discussion. I didn't see many talking out there, but thank you for being here. I know we've had a couple in here for a while. And I want to invite you to keep debating respectfully after the stream ends, okay? And remind you that next time on Jukebox Journey, we'll be back inside of another set of human connections, tracing the decisions, disagreements, replacements, and long-term consequences that quietly shape music history long after the songs themselves have already entered the circulation. All right, y'all. I'm going to say this right now. Get over there to Tuber Chat because they are the best. I will see you Monday for Ask a Bee. Bye-bye.
I want to take a minute to shout out Tuber Chat. If you're a creator who's tired of surface level advice, says, and actually wants to understand how YouTube works, that's the space. It's real conversations with real creators who are in the trenches, building channels, testing ideas. No posturing, no gatekeeping, no fake guru energy, just people sharing what's working, what isn't, and why.
If you're serious about growing, learning, and not doing this alone, check out Tuber Chat. The link is in the description. If you're enjoying this show, subscribing is the easiest way to support what's being built here on BBTV. You'll see the join button right next to subscribe. No pressure, no expectations, just an option for people who want to support the channel in a real way. We're live weekdays at 12 p.m. Central, and each day has its own focus. Same honesty, same voice, just different conversations depending on the day. And if you've got a story you want to share, send it in. Anonymous is always fine.
Boss be rising.